All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'll be talking about our package validation and our package validation framework, and particularly Docker integration. So just a little background slide on me. My name is Nicole Jones. I'm a senior data scientist at Denali Therapeutics. There I wear many hats. I'm a study lead, an R package validation lead, a Shiny developer, and a POSIT admin. Brief disclaimer that all the views shared in this presentation are my own and do not reflect the opinions of my company. All right, so now let's get into the background and what brought me here to talk to you all today. So Denali has always been in open source, has always leveraged open source programming languages. And in particular, we leverage these for internal and exploratory and internal reporting. And then any regulated work was done by CROs and SAS. And so we really wanted to figure out how could we go and bridge this gap from using R for exploratory and internal reporting to using R for regulated work. And so to do that, we needed two things. One, we needed a GXP compliant system that was capable of supporting R workflows. And then we needed a well-defined R package validation process. So we found a vendor that had a compliant GXP compliant statistical computing environment. And that environment leveraged Docker containers for our execution. And so with that in mind, we had to develop our package validation process to be able to work within this system. And so with that, I'll talk about our agenda and the meat of our topic, or my talk today. I will briefly introduce the R Validation Hub's white paper. I will talk about our approach to package validation and how essentially what we laid out. And then finally, I'll talk about Docker integration and how we set up our process so that it would work within a Docker container. So let's talk about the R Validation Hub white paper, which is really the backbone and kind of the foundation for how we defined our process. This QR code here on the screen will take you to the website. There also, I put the URL at the bottom here in case you want to read the entire paper. But this paper was published back in 2020. It was a cross-industry effort. And I think one of the first like really formal documentations on what it meant to what it means to validate an R package. And so they defined this risk-based approach. I'll go through the high-level kind of key takeaways from this paper. And so the first thing that they really laid out were what is the elements of our package validation? And that's three areas. One, making sure the accuracy of the packages and, ensuring that what they're producing and reporting out are accurate results. The reproducibility and making sure that if I were to ship this over to our colleagues at, for example, the FDA, they're able to re-execute and reproduce the exact same analyses that I ran. And then finally, traceability, making sure we know what are we using, versions of packages, versions of R, just really documenting these things. They next laid out this framework. And so if you haven't ever seen this, I'll go through this as well pretty quickly. But this is framework for how do you actually assess a package. So if we, starting on the left here, we have a new package, we determine its classification. So if it's an import in general, these are packages we're not going to explicitly call their functions in our script. That would be called an import. And they recommend doing very minimal checks for that. And for us, it's just can it install? You can determine for your company what checks are appropriate for an import, but in general, it's recommended keep it lean. And then you have the packages that are intended for you. So these are the packages I'm going to load and actually use inside of my R script. The first thing we want to further classify them as is, are they statistical or non-statistical? So a statistical package, you're going to do some additional documentation and review. And so as I mentioned before, I'm a data scientist. Stats is not my expertise. I'm going to bring in my statisticians here. Then our statistical and non-statistical packages continue down this whole workflow where you check different areas, like is it maintained? How widely is it used? How well is it documented? You have all these different areas that you're going to review of the package. And finally, when you get through this whole risk assessment, you look at your results and you decide, is it appropriate for use for GXP work? So can we include it in this validated environment? Or is it not quite appropriate, so we reject the package? And this framework is what we built our process on. And for now, I will go into, again, a high-ish level overview of our process. So in terms of our package validation kind of workflow, I broke it down into 7 general steps. The first 6 are where we actually are assessing the risk or the quality of the package, right? And then in the final seventh step, we're just ensuring that after we've listed all of our validated packages, we're only using those approved packages in our scripts. So I'll walk through all these steps. And when it comes to defining the scope here, the first thing we're going to do is just say what version of what of our lister packages, and then what snapshot date are we going to use. The snapshot date is one of the key parts of this process, and that goes back to the reproducibility. I know that if I want to re-execute this in 3 months, 6 months, a year from now, I can install all those packages from that same snapshot date, have all the same versions of the functions, and be able to re-execute my scripts and reproduce my analysis. Then we check for installation. We make sure, right, that our requested packages and their dependencies can install. And then if we have any packages that are failing installation, we're going to triage this. And in some cases, we can resolve the issue. In some cases, we have the scenario where a dependency of a package needs a newer version of R than we're ready to support. And in that case, unfortunately, the package simply can't be included in the validated library. So this is our first step. Then before we actually start assessing our risk of the package, we're going to take a detour and review our stat packages with our statistician to figure out, are they appropriate for use? And so this is a blurb, an excerpt straight from the R Validation Hub's white paper. And the definition of what a stat package is, it's just any package that implements statistical or machine learning algorithms, even if that's not the primary purpose of the package. And so if I have a package that I determine to be statistical in nature, I'm going to engage with my statistician and work closely with them. We're going to very clearly define the intended use. Statistical packages can have a lot of statistical methods they can apply for. And what we're focused on is not what can the package do, but what do we need for our regulated work. So we're going to focus on that. And then we validate in that package just the functions that would support that statistical work for our GXP, any sort of GXP or regulated work that we're planning to do. And then we provide testing and evidence to support the use. And we document why this was an approved package, a stat package that's approved for use. So after we do this, all of our packages, statistical, non-statistical, will now go through this process of generating what we call a preliminary risk score. And if you're unfamiliar with this package risk metrics, it's an open source package that was, again, another cross-industry effort to essentially help assess packages. And so with risk metrics, there are 19 assessments that are currently part of the package, and they're assessing various elements of a given package that people were already looking at when they were trying to assess the quality of that package. And so they just wrap these into very nice, easy to use functions that produce a result, essentially ranging from 0 to 1. 0 being it's a completely failed, it didn't have any of the requirements we were looking for that assessment. 1 being perfect, it hit every marker that we were looking for. And so after you run these assessments, you'll get this score, and the recommendation is for you and your organization to determine the weights of each of these assessments. So essentially, how important is this given assessment in the overall risk assessment of the package? And so this is a very basic example I have here. We're looking at 3 assessments, the last 30 bug status, which is just at the last 30 bugs, have they been closed? So this would say 75% of the last 30 bugs have been closed based on that score. Export help, and then news current, just saying that we have some help for each of the exported namespaces. And then for the news current is just that the news file has been up to date. And so here I'm doing a weight, and I'm saying, okay, my last 30 bug status is going to be 50% of my overall score. And then the export help and then news current will be 25% of my overall score. I just multiply the scores that came from the assessments by these weights. Then I add them together to get my overall package risk score. So that's a very basic example. Internally, we developed a process that was actually inspired by the MPN scorecard. So I've also added a QR code linking to the original source of where I was inspired to do this. And we grouped our assessments into 4 categories: documentation, maintenance, community adoption, and transparency. We slotted each of the assessments that fits into this category, that best fits into that category. And then within that, each of these categories overall were given an overall weight. And these are then totaled up to come up with our overall risk score. So we've generated our preliminary risk score. The next thing we need to do is look at the unit test, the code coverage, just to make sure that the packages are behaving as the package authors intended for it to behave in our system. We leverage CoverR to do this. If you're unfamiliar with CoverR, it will just execute unit tests and generate an overall code coverage report, basically indicating how many lines of code do the unit tests execute or call. All relevant unit tests are executed. So back to the reference of, like, for example, our stat packages, we might not be validating all the functions. So I'm not going to run all the unit tests. I'm going to run the unit tests that are relevant to my specific function or what I'm intending to validate in that package. And then if there's no unit tests that exist, internal unit tests must be generated. And that's usually where I'm going to work with the requester and really understand what their need is. And then we'll start to develop our own internal tests that we'll use for future validation cycles. So after we do that, then we take, so to get our overall risk score, we're going to take the results from the preliminary risk score, so from these 4 categories, and we're going to combine it with our code coverage to generate an overall package risk score. And then that overall package risk score is what we're going to use to decide, are we going to accept or reject? Your threshold for what you're going to decide, what constitutes a package that can be accepted or rejected, is something that you can determine internally. And yeah, and so then from there, we want to track, okay, we've approved all these packages, we have a validated library. How do we make sure that we're only using those packages in our script? Well, we leverage another open source package called loggerx, and this generates a log file from an R script. This also, using loggerx also addresses back to the traceability aspect that we're really looking for when validating R packages. It provides a great, very comprehensive log file. And so the element that I'm going to highlight in loggerx is the ability to add this section here, where you can list any unapproved packages or functions that are being used. This is not by default in the loggerx output. And so in order to do this, you first generate a list. And in this list, you're going to specify the package and all the functions that you're going to approve for use. So in this case, we're saying for base R, we're only approving mean. For dplyr, we're going to approve all the functions. Then you use the function build_approve to generate an R data object that will it will convert the list into an R data object that loggerx can then use. And then you're going to specify inside of your options to use this R data object in order to use those R data objects for future generation of log files. And finally, you're going to just use execute. So this is the function inside of loggerx that's used to generate the log script by default. So I just say execute, I give it my log script. Now that I've set my global options to use this approved list, it will know to add this section, and it will scan through your R script to list any packages that were unapproved or functions that were unapproved inside this log file. So we've figured out how we do all that. How do I actually execute my my validation workflow? Well, we execute it in the environment we're intending to actually run R in. And we have 2 environments. We have our Posit Workbench and we have our Docker container. Inside of Posit Workbench, that's where we do all of our development work. And so we want to make sure that our packages are behaving as we expect in Posit Workbench. Inside of the Docker container, that's the backer of our SCE, and that's where we're doing all of our production runs. And so again, we want to make sure that our packages are behaving as expected inside of the Docker container as well. And so with that, I'll talk about kind of how we set up our process to make it easier, at least easier for me. And so one of our challenge really was, as I said, to make sure that our packages behave the same between our 2 execution environments, between Posit Workbench, between the Docker container. And for me, I didn't know an easy way to interactively run an R session in a Docker container. I know there's ways to do it, but it was outside of my scope of knowledge. And so what I set our process up for, essentially, is we built a package that reduces the need for interactivity. Because when I start up this Docker container, it's essentially running inside of my console, and essentially all I have is like the little console window of R. I don't have, it's not running inside of like Posit Workbench or inside of RStudio. So I set up this package so that we can just run a function inside the command line, and we don't have to actually interact with any sort of elements in our environment. And then I write out key messages to the console, things that really should walk away, and make sure you understand. Like any key things that are happening in the process are being written out right into the console. The first validation process, or the kind of first time we like really validate our library, I run it in Posit Workbench. This is the first time is when you're likely to run into the most issues. And so I run it in the interactive environment so I can triage any issues that are happening along the way. And then when all is said and done, I save the results as an R data object for use later. Then within the Docker container, I re-execute the validation. As I said, it's simply running a series of functions inside of the console. This Docker, during this execution inside of Docker, it will consume the R data object from the Posit Workbench run. And essentially it will, if any differences are found, it will write those details out to the console. So again, for me to make note of something that we need to review later. Then all the results from from the Docker run will be exported from this container into another R data object. And then I go back to Posit Workbench to investigate these findings and determine if the differences were critical or non-critical. Sometimes the difference is something like I forgot an OS library in the Docker container script that package needed. And so I add that in, it resolves the issue. And sometimes we have yet to run into anything that was unresolvable. So I hope we continue to run into no unresolvable issues. And then finally, we document. We're going to document the validation results from both runs. We are going to document any discrepancies between the platforms and why, if these discrepancies, if the package is still being included in our validated library, why are we allowing these discrepancies to be? And then finally, we're going to document the final list of packages approved for use across both of our environments. And so just wrapping up here, we've done it. We did our first validated library. It was for our version 4.31. I had 31 originally requested packages. 29 of them were approved. 2 were rejected, mostly one because one had no unit test. The other one was because it was statistical in nature and we had no immediate intended use for it. And then finally, we're utilizing this validated library into CSRs. With that, I just want to say thank you for listening to me talk today, and thank you to the organizing RM Pharma for having me here today. And any questions? I see some in the chat, so I can
Yeah.
just running
Thank
through
you
them.
very much, Nicole. I'm here to help you with the questions, and great to virtually see you again, just like at PositConf. But yeah, lots of great questions in the chat. So I'll start reading to you and see
Yeah.
what input. So Mike Smith asks, are there any showstopper type attributes that would immediately make, say, an R package you're evaluating a high risk type of package?
Yeah, great question. So I think, right, if we don't have unit tests, that's immediately like, okay, we're putting this in high risk. We're going to need to immediately review this package in more detail and figure out, is there a better package that we don't have to develop all of our for all of our intended use and develop test scripts. If we don't have things like a GitHub page, that's going to be a pretty big indicator, because then how do I submit my issues, right? And how do we track how they're being reviewed? Those kind of things. No news file, pretty important, because if something changes in a package, I don't know what changed, right? So I think immediately those would be the main ones that come to mind.
Excellent, thank you. And then another one coming from Livermore. How do you validate internally developed packages? Is that process similar, or what do you do
Same
there?
thing. We're in the process of putting together a few internally developed packages, but the intent is they will go through the same assessment. Of course, some of the things like last 30 bug status, some of the things that we're checking other packages for just don't make sense for internally developed packages. So we'll likely remove those. But in general, it's likely gonna be heavily dependent on the code coverage, really, because it's internally developed things.
Yeah, excellent. We're in the process of my organization of doing an SOP on internal packages too, so it'd be great to share notes as you go along with that. Another question that came in our Q&A portion is that unit tests, sometimes they can be pretty trivial in their execution and what they're trying to assess. Now, would you accept trivial tests even for a more complex function, or would you try to build that more sophisticated?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. Right now, the majority of our packages were like table related packages, like things that aren't really statistical or heavily complex. A lot of the functions, I would say, in terms of algorithms. But I would often these non-trivial functions would end up falling in like this stat-ish realm. And if we have those kind of packages, we're really looking detailed at the unit test and figuring out like, are these really hitting the areas that we want in general? So right now, our last library, though, we were able to pretty confidently rely on the exported unit tests without really needing to dig too deeply into them.
Excellent. And Matthias is asking, when you're showing that graphic about the packages that have been through your process, 31 seems like a low number, although I'm not sure how low that is, but did that include some of the imports and dependencies of those packages? Kind of where did you draw the line there?
Yeah, so we have more than 31 in our library. When I listed 30, the 31 originally requested ones are the ones that are intended for use. All of our imports are there. So I think overall in our library, we have closer to like 200-ish packages in there because of all the dependencies.
Excellent. And I know from experience, yeah, you could go down so many rabbit holes and you look at those dependencies too. You've been
Oh,
there, I
don't
know.
open up that can of worms. I say focus on what you're intending to use. If it behaves as expected, we're going to rely on the like, we're going to trust, enough that the package is doing what we need it to do.
Yeah, yeah. Mike's joking. 200 still seems like a number. I'm not so sure about that, but
We're
nonetheless.
for two CSRs. It's lean. It's very lean this time around.
Right, right. Yep. So, yeah, another question that came in. Given that there are different minor versions and major releases of R itself, do you stick to validate packages for major releases, or do you also look at the minor releases as well when they come out?
So we're looking at the time, whatever version of R we're using, right? So
Okay,
the way our organization is set up is we're only using one version of R at a time. And so we looked at 4.3.1, and when we go to rerun, if we decide to upgrade to example 4.4.1, or if there's 4.3.1 by then, that's what we'll validate in. We don't like we do it as needed in a sense. So yeah.
great, great. And we'll wrap up with this last question, going back to the unit test situation, which I've spent many hours on myself. But typically, when you have a complex function, do you have a ballpark on how many unit tests you might write for that? And also, is that person writing the test the same as the one developing the function, or do you split responsibilities? How does that play out?
Yeah, so in terms of internally, I mean, our process not fully defined, but I mean, ideally, right, you have a different person running the unit test because I'm going to be biased to avoid my own bugs, right? And so you ideally are looping in a third party to do those unit tests. And then in terms of like the complexity, really what we look at a lot outside of stat packages, when we're looking at our like the outputs, and we focus a lot more on the outputs and making sure that like we QC what comes out of that function or that package is producing what we expect, right? And so we don't dig in for non-stat packages, we don't dig as detailed into the unit tests for external ones. Internal ones, it just it really it's just a kind of case by case basis.
Excellent, thank you. And yeah, we're happy to stay a little longer if there are any more questions coming in. I'm keeping an eye on it. I think we may have run out there, but yeah, Nicole, I'm super enthusiastic about the pursuits you have in this very important topic, and certainly I would love to learn more about how this is going as this gets more robust at your organization, because every one of us is dealing with this in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah, yeah, I'm more than happy to chat some more, Eric. It's always nice to see you and always nice to get a chance to connect. Yeah.